My association with the Indian School of Business seems to have always been linked to success. And here you folks want me to speak about failure. And I thought about that and said, actually, why not? Why is it that we keep trying to brush our failures under the carpet? The truth is there isn't a successful person on this planet who hasn't known some failure at some point in their lives. And if they tell you they've never known failure, well, there'll be one coming around the corner, believe me. That's the way the world is. It's exactly when you think you're sort of timing the strokes well and hitting the fours off the meat of the bat that the unexpected shooter comes along and bowls you, if the cricketing metaphor makes any sense to all of you here. And life is like that. That's the way it tends to be. But I was thinking about failure very much in the Indian context from which you've all emerged. Because for us, failure has a very special place in our consciousness because of the fact that we are in an environment in which success means so much more. An intensely competitive environment. It's tough to get into a good school, tough to get into a good college, tough to get a good job. At every stage of our life, we are being driven on towards success, towards fear and rejection of failure. I came up against my first experience of defeat. I'd had a few other successes, the most enjoyable being elected president of St. Stephen's College Student Union on the slogan Shashi Tharoor jeetega zarur, which actually worked out, you know. And then I also had I was the first elected staff representative of all the UN High Commissioner for Refugee staff around the world. So I'd had all of these. I'd never really known a setback until I was invited by the government of India to run for Secretary General of the United Nations. And I kind of allowed myself to believe this was destiny. I did have a very unusually extensive experience in all the important domains of the UN's work: humanitarian, peacekeeping, the political work of the Secretary General's office, being in the Security Council, being in the fundraising business, being in public information, managed budgets, being an Under-Secretary General. So I thought, this is it. You know, my entire life has been a preparation for this. And I went out and campaigned, though my nomination had been rather last minute. And as you all know, I didn't make it. In the very first ballot, I came 2 votes shy of Mr. Ban Ki-moon. And in the final ballot, I was vetoed by as we all now know, the United States. But by a permanent member is all we knew at that time. And in the UN Security Council, when a permanent member votes against you, you're out. Now, for me, that was a very major blow. And you know, one can look back and think about all the things that might have gone wrong. But I had to essentially deal with the first major failure of my life, the first major professional setback in my life. And I found myself dealing with it in 2 ways. Not by minimizing the significance of it. A defeat is a defeat. As Groucho Marx cruelly said, close but no cigar. You know, I didn't get the cigar to celebrate, and therefore, at the end of the day, there was a defeat one had to come to terms with. I was, to some degree, comforted in the idea one had instilled in one from the Bhagavad Gita that ultimately you do your duty without expectation of reward, and the reward is not the only purpose of the effort. You make the effort because it was worth making in its own right. And you know, for India, we'd never put forward formally a candidate for Secretary General ever before. Under the sort of Buggins-Stern system we have in the UN Security Council for Secretaries General, it informally evolved into a situation where there'd be 10 years for each continent. So if Asia got it in 2006, then 2016 would be a European, 2026 would be a Latin American, 2036 would be an African, and it would be 2046 before India got another turn. So if India was going to bid for it, this was clearly the only time it could in the foreseeable future. And certainly for me, I'd be 90 in 2046, so I wasn't going to be a contender later. So when this opportunity came, this was the right thing to do, and it was the right thing to make the best and most sincere possible effort to make this work. It didn't work. Now, one thing you have to recognize is to understand the circumstances of why it didn't work. And I'm not talking about assigning blame or pointing fingers. You have to understand one basic fact. In something like this, it's not about the best resume, it's not about the most relevant credentials, it's not even about the fluency in both the UN languages, English and French, which I had. It's not about any of those things. It's ultimately about the political choices made by the 15 members of the Security Council, and most important, the 5 permanent members. And if for whatever reason their political calculation was one way, the rest was irrelevant. So you had to accept that failure is not necessarily because you were not the right person or didn't try hard enough or whatever. Failure is because often in life, failure comes from circumstances you cannot control, and which are very important to those who are making the decisions that reflect your failure. And those are important considerations and relevant considerations, but they may not be ones that you could do very much about. From that experience, however, came a second thing. The realization that every setback is always also an opportunity. The victor, Ban Ki-moon, invited me to stay on at the UN, and I politely said no. I could have stayed on because in any case I was still relatively young. I was 51. I wouldn't have been obliged to retire till I was 60 in those days. It's now gone up to 65. But I felt that having sought the top job and lost, that my staying on would be in bad taste because anything I said or did would seemingly cast a shadow on the person who had won. And I thought it was best that I leave a free hand and not hang around. And then I had to rethink my life. And rethinking my life, abbreviating a process that took 1.5 years, eventually led me back to India and into Indian politics, where despite my failure, one consequence of that failure had been a greater awareness of who I was, what my credentials were, what my background was, that gave me the name recognition that led 2 or 3 of the parties in our country to offer me an opportunity to contest the elections of 2009. And I took what I believed to be the right party for the country, fought the election and won, and arguably I might not have been in a position to do so had I not achieved the prominence that failure had given me. So there's one more example. I know it's a cliche. Everyone says, if life shuts a door on you, open a window, and all of these, Easter card kind of one-liners. But there's actually some truth to these cliches. Very often cliches are cliches because they're true, and so people keep saying them. Failure in this very intensely personal sense. I am essentially encouraging all of you to think along these lines. As I learned from the UN race, do the best that you can do, and then you cannot reproach yourself for failing. Because if failing is for circumstances beyond your control, all you can reproach yourself for is if you didn't try to do everything you could have tried. If you've done your best, worked hard and sincerely, then it is not truly failure, it is merely a lesson. Secondly, as I said, allow failures to open doors for you. Try and do something different that may actually create opportunities for you to find a different meaning for success in your own life. And third, when, as we saw in that last example I gave you, when a failure and a setback seems to be one that actually there's no redeeming feature for, you just knuckled under, do your very best at whatever it is you can be allowed to do, and demonstrate through your excellence at that you are not to be defined by the failure that set you back. It's another cliche I'm going to toss at you, that it doesn't matter how hard you fall, it only matters how quickly you pick yourself up. And that is again a sort of greeting card line, but it's a very, very real line. Ultimately, you need to be able to stand up and show what you're worth. One of the things, by the way, a small tip on the margins for those of you who encounter failure, try not to let it show. I remember Kofi Annan, my late boss as UN Secretary General, telling me once during a particularly hard moment in his life, an African proverb that his father had taught him. And I couldn't understand the proverb anyway. He said the proverb is, when the sharks bite you, do not bleed. I thought, how can that be? When the sharks bite you, of course you'll bleed. And I finally understood the meaning of it when I started going through this. Is not so much a failure as a lot of unjustified accusations amongst very, very vested interests in and outside the media and in politics relating to the passing away of my wife. When all these accusations are coming, I realized suddenly what he meant. They want the satisfaction of seeing you bleed. If you deny them that satisfaction, they'll soon give up biting because they've got nothing to gain out of it. And it turned out to be a very valuable lesson. It also applies to failures. When you fail, don't show yourself to be a defeated person. Rather, show yourself to be a determined person who will succeed the next time. The another cliche of Robert Bruce, who kept on trying and trying and trying until he succeeded. And there's another, I think, an American sportsman who said, if you fail, it doesn't matter. You may not succeed next time. You may fail again, but fail better. So let me just say, all of us will have failures, but we can fail better by learning the kinds of lessons I've tried to tell you. And at the same time, if each of us is determined to do the best we can for ourselves, ultimately, the simplest lesson in life is be the best you that you can be. Right? Nobody else can be a better you than you are. You know what you're capable of. You know what yardsticks you can set yourself. You know what your talents are. You know what you can do that's within the realm of possibility, or even a slight stretch. We should always stretch our possibilities, see how far we can go. But you also know that, if you can't sing, you can't sing. You can't be made a failure in a singing contest because somebody else sings better. Well, you're not a singer. You may have some other talent. Develop that talent, explore it, and be the best you can be at that. And it seems to me that as long as you're the best you that you can possibly be, you may not ever avoid or escape the risk of failure, but you will bounce from it to go on to future success. Thank you very much.